Well, the next thing to talk about with regards to training as you get older, technique should change as we go along. I mean, traditionally in China, they used to teach the hard styles of Kung Fu first, all the Shaolin stuff, and as people got older, then they start learning Tai Chi. So it was expected that your technique and your method of training should change as you age, which is natural and sensible. Okay, it was pretty much the same way in Okinawa as well. But then karate got taken to Japan, and the Japanese were a little bit more one-size-fits-all approach to their karate. Now, what I'm going to talk about here, I would say actually applies to everybody really, but it applies more when you get older. And I have talked about these subjects before. The first thing I want to talk about is moving from the waist instead of the hips. Okay, now this is a bit of a sacred cow in most Japanese martial arts and Korean martial arts as well. They all say move from the hips. Okay, but very, very slight difference. Okay, only a small difference in height, and you're at the waist. Now, the Chinese styles, which we're based on, used to say move from the waist. Oh, sorry, they still do say move from the waist. It's only the Japanese and Korean styles that emphasize moving from the hips instead of the waist. Now, a lot of the old texts by the old masters talk about moving from the hara, okay? And the hara is the waist, okay? So there's a clue. In the original karate, original Okinawan masters, it was more from the waist than from the hips. Now, there's a couple of good reasons for this. First of all, the waist is a lot more flexible. I'll show you. You can do this sitting on the chair, or you can do this sitting on the floor. It doesn't really matter. But if I sit on the floor without rocking my backside around, without kind of pulling my backside off the floor, if I just sit here, put my hands on my waist and turn the waist, you can see how far the waist is moving, but my hips aren't moving. My hips are still on the floor, but my waist is moving quite a bit. So that's the first thing. Your waist is a lot more flexible than your hips are. Now, the other thing is a lot of older people, as we get older, we get a lot of hip problems and a lot of knee problems. I've particularly had quite a lot of knee problems, which I'll talk about more in a later video. But for now, talking about the hips, if I kind of coil that leg and just do a reverse punch, if I push into the hip and I lock that hip out, well, first of all, constantly locking that hip out isn't necessarily good for it over the long term, especially if you've got hip problems. Now, most of my body weight is pushing forward here, but as I push the hip forward, so it tends to pull my stomach back in. So some of my body weight is going forward, some of it is going backwards. If instead of pushing into the hip, I coil that leg and I push into the waist, so I push the waist forward, it's only a very, very small adjustment to your technique, but it's quite a big difference. So if I coil that leg and I push it into the waist, now that hip joint is not locked out. Okay, I can actually move my waist further, as I demonstrated when I was sitting on the floor. I can move the waist further, so I've got all that body weight going forward. None of the body weight is coming back. Okay, but that hip joint is not locked out. It's more relaxed, and that means I'm not putting pressure on a hip joint. A lot of the senior Japanese instructors have had knee and hip operations. It's not much talked about. Okay. But it's happened quite a lot. There's one very senior Japanese instructor in my country, in the United Kingdom, who I'm not going to mention. Years ago, he was being interviewed, and the interviewer asked him about older people training in karate. Should they modify their training as they get older? And his answer was, no, they should just work harder to keep up. That same instructor's had a couple of hip operations. So what does that tell you? Okay. Technically, the guy I'm talking about is absolutely excellent. He's absolutely superb, technically. But they do this as a living, so they have to get the hip operations and all the rest of it For a lot of us, it can mean months off work, and not all of us can afford that. Plus, do we want to damage our bodies that way anyway? Okay, if I go back to the Chinese way of doing things and just push into here rather than push into there, it makes my technique much more relaxed, it takes the pressure off the hip, and I don't damage my body quite so much. Now, there's a couple of clues when we look at some of the older katas here. Bearing in mind, karate used to be called China hand because it was very much based on Chinese martial arts. And like I say, the Chinese talk about moving from the waist. They don't talk about moving from the hips. So if I take katas like Tekki, for example, where it's all done in horse stance, and I can't get into too deep a stance because I say my knees aren't too good. But if I get into my horse stance, I'm quite restricted how far I can move the hip. But I can still move the waist quite a lot further. Okay, so if there's a lot of techniques in Tekki, like the Kakasuki hook punch, the MP, the elbow strike, this double punch, which if we're doing it just moving the hip, it doesn't make a lot of sense because it's very difficult to get the body weight around there. Certainly with the elbow, it's difficult to get that around there. But when you move from the waist, okay, then it's much easier to get that body weight around there. Now, also another clue, it's said that karate is primarily a linear style, kung fu is primarily a circular style. Now, this is often kind of confusing in definitions because if I take a reverse punch, my body is rotating, okay, so that's going circular, but the punch is going straight. So is that a circular technique or a linear technique? Well, it's actually a linear technique because the definition of a linear technique is your body weight is going forward. Okay, so I'm using forward momentum to kind of power the technique. With a circular technique, they're using centrifugal force. So in some kung fu styles, they do things like this, where they may be kind of the stance will be facing that way, they'll kind of block and punch out that way. So I've turned my stance, my body, about 180 degrees. Okay, it's a big centrifugal turn, and I'm using that centrifugal force to generate the power of the punch. Okay, even though the punch is going out linear, it's a centrifugal force that's powering it. So that's one of the big differences between Kung Fu and karate. However, if you look at some of our older katas, as I say, with Tekki, it's very difficult to move the hips around. I'm moving up and down sideways, so there is no or hardly any linear force because I'm not going forward. However, if I turn the waist, okay, I can now generate centrifugal force. Okay, so Tekki, like I say, it's more close to its ancestor styles, more close to its ancestor Chinese styles, where we're generating centrifugal force and using that as a power source rather than linear. Obviously, if you look at Bosai Dai and the Heian katas, there's a lot more linear movement in there. But Tekki was one of the main katas in karate. Yeah, Funakoshi was the master who introduced karate to Japan back in the 1920s. When he started learning karate, he spent, I think it was the first 10 years, learning 3 Tekki katas, or Naihanchi as the Okinawans called them. And all the 3 Tekki katas are in horse stance, going up and down in a line. There's no linear movements. So a large part of what we're doing is based on circular movements. Right, looking at some of the karate warm-up exercises that we do, there's some which are kind of, I say, fairly unique to karate because I've not seen them used anywhere else at all. And for example, this one that we do. Okay, now we turn the waist around. When I first started learning this, and for many, many years, I used to focus on turning the shoulders and turn them as far as I can. But after I learned that rather than focusing on the hips, focus on the waist, now when you come to exercises like this, think of turning the waist instead. Don't worry about the shoulders, just let them take care of themselves, but really focus on the waist, okay? And this fits in kind of when you do it that way, you make the waist obviously a bit more flexible. You can use it better to generate power into your technique. And again, it's there in our warm-up, been there for years and years and years, and nobody really kind of put two and two together and realised. So focus on turning the waist rather than the shoulders, okay? Also, while you're doing it, try and get the whole section rotating, because sometimes people focus on just turning the tummy and getting the tummy going, and so we say turning from the spine at the back of the torso. But rather than doing it that way, focus on turning from the middle of your torso. Feel where your core muscles will be and turn from there rather than from the spine. And as you're turning, hopefully you'll feel this part twisting at the front, and you should also feel like around the kidneys, feel it twisting around there. So you get this all-round flexibility of the lower waist, okay, which will help you with the techniques that we've just been talking about. Also another one, please excuse my microphone cable, but that's all I got. The other one that we do in karate quite often is this one, which again, exactly the same feeling. Don't think about getting the shoulders around. Forget the shoulders, okay? Focus on the waist, twisting that waist. And again, twisting from the core muscles at the center. So you're twisting at the front of the tummy, and you're also twisting around the kidneys. So the whole of the waist is turning, okay? And then when you come back to what we was talking about earlier on, where we're doing so for example, a reverse punch, it's so much easier to move that waist and get that extra body weight going forward. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave me a like and a comment below. Share it with your friends, because so many people, as we get older, a lot of people have to give up their karate training or their martial art training, whatever the style they do, because they get pain in the hips, because they get pain in the knees. And if we can help yourself and other people like you to keep on training, then obviously that's a good thing. So please help me to promote these videos and share them with people. Thank you.